This is the YT Decoy. The bike has been around for a few years now, but this year YT have finally released a bigger battery to both keep up with the ever-changing demands of the e-bike market and also to keep us out on the trails riding for longer. It's a familiar looking frame that, in my opinion, still looks very clean and classy, and with a few minor updates over the years such as the Shimano EP8 motor, a 170mm fork, and now a 720 watt-hour removable battery. To achieve the bigger battery, YT had to find a way of cramming in more cells, but at the same time, they didn't want to compromise the way that the bike handled. Looking at the original 540 battery and comparing it with the 720 side by side, it's clear to see the bigger battery has grown larger. More cells means more weight. The original battery weighs in at 3.61 kilograms, and the new 720 battery comes in at 4.47 kilos. Take a close look at the bike with a 540 battery installed and watch the belly of the bike change slightly with the larger battery. It's a subtle but noticeable difference. But with this change, battery capacity is increased by a significant 34%. And that weight is slung as low as possible to help preserve the handling characteristics of the bike. My test bike, sized in extra large, weighs in at 23.9 kilograms. That's including changing the lightweight Exo Plus trail tyres in favour of something more suited to the terrain that the bike is aimed at. Although the bike is an XXL, the sizing is on the more compact side, especially for a taller rider. The reach is 489mm, and the wheelbase is fairly short compared to some other brands' extra large bikes. I don't have a problem too much with shorter bikes, as long as they're paired with slack head angles and longer travel. And overall stability is provided by much more than just reach alone, so I was intrigued to ride this on some of my local steep enduro tracks. First thing I noticed was how low the front end felt. The fork steerer had been cut fairly short and I couldn't run the stock bars any higher, so the only thing that I could do here was to fit some higher bars. I went up from the stock 30s to a 38mm rise. This was to give me more support over the front end and more leverage on the bars. With the bike now fully sorted for my size, and some beefier, grippier rubber on the wheels, it was time to spend a few days hitting some of my local trails. With a 720 battery installed, I didn't really have to think about range at all. The bike loves to be ridden down some classic techie trails, and despite its long travel and increased weight due to the bigger battery, I found it really rewarding and playful for a long travel enduro bike. I enjoyed pushing myself and the bike as hard as I could, the chassis giving good feedback and the rear suspension tune offered really high levels of grip and confidence. And even when my will outweighed my skill, I found that I just wanted to keep on riding. I did notice that the bike had some of the rattle noise associated with the EP8 motor, but I'm used to it after a couple of rides and can almost tune it out, but it's still there nonetheless. Most of my rides were on techie enduro style trails, but I actually found the bike pretty comfortable to just pedal across some local XC tracks and explore some lesser known parts of where I live. Now usually I'm a fan of 29 wheels front and rear, but there's a distinct advantage to both different sizes. So a 29 tends to roll through some of the chunk a little bit more efficiently, I think anyway. But there are some significant advantages to having a 29 front and a 27.5 on the rear, also known as a Mullet or MX setup. Now, what I'm finding with the smaller rear wheel, there's a couple of things. First of all, you've got less wheel material, there's less aluminium, there's less rubber, so there's less weight out the rear. So you get less of this centrifugal kind of spinning force out the back. So it does feel that the rear end is lighter, and paired with a smaller size, less rotational force, it does feel like it carves in and tips around and can maneuver around things easier than a 29. So I'm finding that I can pick the bike up and move it and move the back end around quicker and easier, and it feels a bit more agile out the rear. It's quite tall here, you see. It's a quite high stack there. I'm actually finding it does get in the way a little bit. So because I'm kind of trying to get my center of gravity low, this is the thing that's stopping me getting lower. So there's some sections where I'd like to be as low as possible to keep my balance, my center of gravity low. I can hang off the back of the bike like that, which is fine in some situations, but there's some situations where I want my weight a little bit further forward to get some grip on the front wheel, get the suspension working. And I'm finding this kind of tall seat post here a little bit of a limiting factor and a little bit irritating on some of the steep stuff. That being said, this was only really a problem on some of the steepest tracks that I could find. There is also a small plastic spacer on the dropper that's pre-installed, but it can actually be removed to reduce the stack height by around 10mm, which will definitely help. So in terms of climbing on the bike, the seat angle is fairly slack, so it doesn't lend itself to getting your weight forward, especially if you're on a bigger bike and you're quite tall. Because as your saddle is high, it's basically pointing back. My center of gravity is almost through this back wheel, which means the front has a tendency to want to lift up. So it's quite difficult to weight it. Whereas if my saddle is slammed, my center of gravity is lower, my effective seat angle is a little bit steeper, and I find that I can get the bike to climb stuff a lot easier in this position. I would prefer, however, to have a steeper seat angle. Componentry wise on this Core 4 model, I was really happy with the suspension, the drivetrain and the brakes. Tucked neatly under the shock is this little water bottle that can stash around half a litre. Now e-bikes should be great at climbing just as much as they are descending, so how does a YT Decoy perform here? I do find the Shimano EP8 pretty good at lower cadences. It does lose a little bit of steam compared to the competitors at some of the higher cadences, and as it gets a little bit steeper, it doesn't quite have the same grunt, but it's still capable of climbing some ridiculously steep things. I have gone down to a smaller rear tyre as well. I'm on a 2.4, the stock is a 2.6. Just was curious to try it with a 2.4 on the rear end. I find that you get a little bit more of a responsive feeling. A 27 with a 2.4 on climbing, finding I'm losing a little bit of traction even with this DHR2. So I think a beefier rear tyre would definitely lend itself to climbing. But on the descents, this setup is amazing. It is so much fun. Agile, poppy, playful, all of those words that are used to describe a fun bike apply to this bike here. The rear suspension tune is outstanding. So the YT Decoy, it's actually been around for a few years now. So they do a MX version, this one that I've been riding, and they actually do it in a 29er as well. Front triangle's the same, and the rear is a little bit longer to accommodate that 29er rear wheel. So you actually have a choice of MX or 29er, depending on preference. But the frame itself originally came out in 2019, and I went to that original launch. Now, the bike still rides amazingly well. In fact, it's been updated with the 170 fork since I first rode it a few years ago. And I feel that with the 170 fork and the 165 rear wheel travel, you get a really good mixture of almost mini downhill ability with the bike, but because you've got the mullet and the shorter rear end, something that definitely feels like it wants to tuck in and move around the tight and twisty corners. So the handling of the bike is awesome, and in fact, going down gravity-based tracks, that is where this bike really excels. It loves going down steep stuff, gnarly stuff, rooty, poppy, jumpy trails. This is in its absolute element. And I do find with the 29er and the 27.5, you can definitely maneuver it around some of the tighter stuff. It doesn't have the outright rolling speed for the chunk as a 29 does, but all biking is a compromise. Where there's benefits somewhere, there's disadvantages in other areas. So an MX bike is a really attractive proposition for lots of people. Now the geometry is fairly conservative really for an electric mountain bike in 2023, and I hope when they update the geometry with it. I hope the head angle is slightly slacker, hope the seat tube gets shaved down a little bit, but don't get me wrong, the rear suspension, it is one of the sweetest rear suspensions. The progressivity of it through that 165 of rear wheel travel, and the Fox factory suspension on this top end model is really sublime. On an e-bike, the Fox factory stuff just works beautifully. I'm a big fan of the Fox 38 and the X2, specifically the e-tuned Fox 38 that exists in this bike here. Now the bigger battery, I feel, is a must for this bike. I rode it exclusively with the 720 watt hour, and because the weight is slung really low in the frame, I think that you're getting a real sweet spot in terms of the benefits of the bigger battery. And this bike's coming in at under 24 kilos, so it's kind of in the ballpark figure for an enduro mountain bike with this kind of travel. Sub 24 kilos is a good place to be. But because the battery is sunk so low in the frame, you don't really feel that extra weight. In fact, in some instances, I bet it helps with the chunky stuff when you're sending it down, because the extra weight often can help it just plow through things in a straight line. So you get a really decent increase in capacity and therefore riding duration for a very small weight penalty. The only thing is, I wish YT sold the bikes with the 720 batteries. Looking on their site at the moment, you get the bike and it comes with the 540, and you have to buy the 720 as an additional upgrade. Now, that's pretty sweet if you actually want two batteries, but a lot of people just want the single battery, and it would be good to see the bike packaged with that 720 watt battery so you don't have to spend any more money. So there are some downsides like I mentioned in the video, but a couple of things that are worth calling out is the Shimano stuff still rattles. You can still hear it in this frame. It's just inherent to that motor. It would also be nice to have that display updated from Shimano to show percentages on there. I always find when I'm riding Shimano bikes that just the 5 bars aren't extremely accurate, so I'd like to see a percentage gauge on there. That's not this bike. All Shimano based bikes have these inherent Shimano characteristics built into them, and the motor's not quite as punchy as some of the competition. Down low, this motor does have some grunt. It's just at that top end where I think it loses out. Now, I've been riding the bike with a 2.4 rear tyre, and I do feel it helps it carve in, but one of the reasons that I got the 2.4 tyre was because I couldn't get a 2.6 in like a double down or a downhill compound. The ones that come on the bike are quite weedy, and I do find it's not just about the puncher resistance with the double down or downhill style tyres, it's also about the riding characteristics and the rebound characteristics of riding with those burlier tyres. So whilst you do get increased puncher resistance, that's a bonus, I find that the heavier duty tyres feel a lot plusher and they just add a bit more comfort and support to the ride. So hopefully at some point we'll be able to get a 2.6 rear in a double down compound from Maxxis. Obviously there's loads of other brands to choose from, but I wanted to run as close to stock as I could. I think this bike is amazing for sending it down stuff and shuttling to the top. This is where the strength lies in this bike. You can set it up to be like a mini downhill bike, nice and soft with 170 and 165 travel, or you can run it a little bit firmer to make it feel like a really capable enduro bike. So smashing it down the rough stuff, carving in and out corners, moving that rear end around, this is what that bike is excelling at in terms of its performance. It's really fun to ride and a really engaging ride. It's not like a plow through everything passenger type ride. It's more of a pump it around and push it and feel the bike and have a bit more fun with it. So if you're looking for a fun bike to smash it down some rough enduro tracks and have a good time and a blast when you're doing it, this is still a really competent bike to own. As ever, thanks for watching. It's been awesome to create this video and I hope you guys like it. Subscribe for more e-bike content and I'll catch you soon.